Our speaker today, I am really super fired up to have with us, and it is Terry Looper. And Terry is the founder and the president and CEO of Texon. And wow, he's done a great job of building and leading a company. We'll hear a lot about how that's worked in his life in a few minutes. He is a guy who is passionate to mentor fellow businessmen and nonprofit leaders. He's been super involved in the nonprofit world and building into our community. And I'll tell you quite personally, I'm very thankful that he's the author of a book called Sacred Pace, 4 Steps to Hearing God and Aligning Yourself with His Will. This is my own personal, well-worn copy of his book, highlighted, and my wife and I read this together during a very important season of our life as we were going through a time of great transition, and it was a real gift and blessing to us. So I'm thankful to be able to talk with Terry today, and here he is now. Terry, welcome.
Thank you, Tom. Glad to be here. Hopefully it'll be of value to all of us.
Yeah, I'm certain that it will be. I appreciate that. So, I'll just some guys know you, some don't, but I just want to invite you in our time to tell us some of your story. Tell us a little about, before we get into, the nuts and bolts of what you've learned. Tell us a little bit about your backstory, about your growing up years and maybe your faith journey.
Well, I grew up in Texas City, south of Houston, right near Galveston. I was actually born in Galveston, which they allow me to say I'm a BOI, born on the island. So, it is what it is. But I went all the way through high school there in Texas City, and probably the highlight of my 18 years or so there were I met my high school sweetheart, Doris, and we dated through high school and eventually got married, and we've been married 51 years. So it's bless her heart, it's been a journey. It's been rougher on her than it has on me, that's for sure. But wow, what a blessing it's been. I was actually baptized when I was about 8. My parents, at a little Presbyterian church there in Texas City, my parents went to church pretty regularly when I was young, and then as I grew older, they kind of quit going. But as I dated Doris, she was in a local Church of Christ church, and I would go with her. She was real faithful, more faithful than me. And I would say the one thing that stands out, my parents did as well as they knew how. They loved me best they knew how, and don't hear anything negative here, but I became a huge people pleaser because in looking back, they kind of ignored me. They didn't really want a third kid. And, even my mother bragged when I was an infant that she didn't hold me and thought that was a big deal. Well, evidently it was a big deal that it probably caused me to become a pretty severe people pleaser through middle school, high school, and on through life. So in high school, I wanted to get ahead and try to get the attention of my parents. So I wanted to succeed really bad. So I wanted to be in a lot of clubs and organizations, but I never wanted to be an officer where I had to make a decision that some people might not like. So I was a vice president of the student council because they didn't have to do anything. But I could be president of the class our senior year because that president didn't do anything either. So that gives you a little flavor of my drive if you want to call it drive. A lot of it very dysfunctional in the way I did it.
Yeah. Wow. Well, in your book, before I go on, I want to tell guys too, if you've been on Zoom calls, down at the bottom that you have an opportunity to type in a question. And when Terry's done here, I'm going to ask him a variety of questions as we go through. But I know that when he finishes, if you have a question for him, we'll be glad to handle some of those. We may not get to all of them, but we can get to some of them. So you can type those in. Yeah. So Terry, in your book, you share about how the worst day of your life turned out to be sort of a life-changing moment, a catalyst, a fresh start, new perspective.
Sure.
Can you tell us a little bit about that and what led up to it and what happened in the midst of it?
Sure. Well, that, bless Darcy's heart, she had to put up with all that drive and blindness in my eyes. So I worked for Monsanto Chemical Company for 10 years, and then I quit them and went to work for a small oil refiner. But as soon as I got there, within 90 days, they went bankrupt. So it still was functioning, but I joined one of my old customers at Monsanto as one is, number 2 employee, and we started an energy marketing company. And it was the first time I ever thought I had the opportunity for unlimited income. So between his drive and my drive, it was 4 years of tough times, particularly for my bride and me ignoring my children from that standpoint. So about 2 years into that journey of building this energy company and pretty much all consuming, I started getting dizzy. And it was significant enough that I went to a regular medical doctor and he said it was stress. I said, well, I've never heard of stress causing dizziness. He said, well, that's the deal. And I said, well, give me some pills for that. And he said, no, I'm not doing that. Anyway, so I said, okay, well, I went on about my way. And the dizziness turned into kind of a fuzziness in my brain over the next year or so. And going into the 4th year, right before we sold the company for a nice profit, I got to where I couldn't make big decisions. My brain didn't really want to go there. And then right towards the end, before we sold, I got to where I couldn't make little decisions. So much so that I would kind of disguise and delay and figure out how to dodge the answers. Well, on a Saturday morning at home with my wife and daughters, 2 daughters, who were about 9 and 12, my brain shut down. Now, I still knew where I was and I knew who was in the room, but it was unwilling to think. It was unwilling to consider thinking about any issues or problems in life. And so Darcy escorted me to my bedroom, our bedroom, and shut the shades, shut the door, and left me alone. Well, all I really could do was cry. I mean, I thought I lost my brain. I thought I lost my mind, my most prized possession. I thought it was my most prized possession. And eventually I didn't know what else to do. So I'd been going to church and praying. So I got on my knees and prayed to the Lord and asked him to take control of my life. Well, I released a lot of my anxiety at that moment, and he took it and he was gracious. And then from that journey became a whole new life. I went to a psychologist about a week later, and he told me that I had burned out, but it's a pretty light case. But it clearly would come again if I didn't do some hard work. I went, well, it scared the fool out of me. So I said, all right, let's get it on. And we started that walk. And that's where I learned I was a huge people pleaser. That's where I also learned that I had a false God was money rather than God. So we had to deal with why that was driving me. And then eventually I realized I had been born again that morning when I got on my knees. And I say, eventually I figured it out because I had been tithing 10%. I had been a deacon and I was getting ready to be ordained as an elder the next Saturday or Sunday. And I prayed and I believed in Christ and I believed in God, but so does the devil believe in him. And what I realized is I had the faith like a 6-year-old with Santa Claus. I had true faith, but I wanted to tell him what to do rather than try to surrender and do what he would like me to do. So that became a whole new journey, completely new journey.
So tell us about coming out of that journey. And, it sounds like the burnout became this incredible blessing. I mean, what was it like coming out of that and how did life change?
I'd really been a very poor boss, always trying to manipulate people to get what I want rather than speak the truth. or tell them really what's going on, how we need to improve in running things. I was absentee when I was home in terms of a father or a husband because I was preoccupied. The people-pleasing thing caused me to fret all the time about what people thought. And so it was the beginning of change. It was the beginning of freedom in my soul, a liberation of my soul. As the more I surrendered to the Lord, the more whole I felt, the more free I felt. I actually was in probably a sense of wilderness. We ended up selling our company at that time, and I owned 10% of the company and received more money than really a boy from Texas City ever really expected to receive. And so I probably was in a season about 4.5 years. And through that 4.5 years, I worked hard at becoming the man that God wanted me to become, and the husband and the father. So I invested heavily in that. And so we sold our company, and I was still employed by it, but it wasn't very engaging or very challenging or motivating. And eventually I wanted to start a new company of energy marketing like I had been doing. And but I wanted to start it my own. I wanted to finally be willing to wear a black hat, not always want to wear a white hat, meaning I was wanting to be a good leader, a whole leader. And eventually, though my big concern is if I started a company back up, I'd be consumed and possibly even burn out. But mainly, more importantly, I wouldn't have a relationship with my wife and my daughters and my Lord like I had developed in the last 4 years. So I refused to start the company unless I figured that out. And it delayed the startup for quite a while, but eventually I got severe peace, significant peace, a better word, that the Lord said, start the company, but only work 40 hours a week and have no sales metric goals. So you'll won't have any false gods, and you will come home free to spend time with me and your family. And that was radical. I don't recommend anybody to start a company on 40 hours a week. I've never known anybody to do it since. And that was 30 years ago, 31 years ago. But what I do recommend is anybody that gets that kind of conviction from the Lord, do it. Jump off the cliff. Jump off the cliff and you'll never look back.
Well, let me just ask a couple questions. So it sounds like, make sure we're all understand, that you had this drive and a kind of a sense of a performance drivenness, but there was this kind of a protective side to it. You didn't want to be that key leader role because of the people pleasing,
right.
But the drive to perform was at its root in some ways anyway, about pleasing people, impressing people, that sort of thing. Is that right?
Right.
Wow.
Trying to make a lot of money. I learned in therapy, I wanted to make a lot of money to finally get my parents' attention. And, of course, you know how that is. It's a vicious circle, right?
Yeah.
So that didn't work either. So it had to be between me and the Lord and just grow up, mature. And I call it the little boy in me had to grow up and give up all those issues it had as a kid. Of course, it's a lifelong journey, right, of getting rid of all that.
Yeah, absolutely. So you made this decision, like the way you put it, is to be the guy who wears the black hat rather than the white hat. You know, that is, you're willing to be the guy who has to make the hard decisions, I assume.
Right.
That is incredible.
The white hat came easy for me. I could still do that. It was the black hat that I had to honor the Lord, because I had to be whole. I had to be what I had to be if I wanted to be a leader.
Yeah. Can you recall, I don't know, maybe it won't stand out, but can you recall times when you first started Texon and you made those two commitments? We're going to do this on 40 hours a week and have no sales metrics. Can you remember some crossroads in there? Or I'm sure there were some where you go, oh, wow, I got to walk by faith by walking out of the office. Or you have anything that
Well, is interesting. I was so fearful that it would fail that my faith, in some ways, during that era, was maybe even greater than it is today in certain ways, because I thought that's stupid and ludicrous. There's no way you can start a company on 40 hours a week and succeed. I was putting up my own money and my own ego, my own pride. I never run a company by myself. And so consequently, my faith was just sheer surrender, because I didn't see how it'd work without him taking the lead. So about 6 months into the company, my daughters, or maybe at that point, 9 and 12, maybe, no, they were a little older than that, but they said, Dad, we don't understand. This is dinner one night. They said, we don't understand why you were all fretting about starting Texon, that you wouldn't be still a good father and husband. That's not exactly how they said it, but we hadn't noticed any difference in you in the 6 months you've been at Texon than before. Well, I still wasn't making an income. The company was still losing money. I was not drawing a salary. So I just cried, not at the table, but later, because only God could. I mean, I'm clearly not that gifted or that good. And I just cried, because that the Lord, I'm going, how in the world do you do that? Still not knowing if it succeed, but at least I had been able to keep the commitment that I made, and that was they didn't notice any different in the fact that I was losing money and hadn't got it off the ground yet. Right. But yeah, and I also made a commitment to myself. I refused to let the little boy in me let the company fail because of my pride, greed, fear, lust, whatever, envy, all that. I just refused to let the company fail because of my own crud. And I told the psychologist, I'm coming back if one of those issues, one of those sins becomes pronounced enough to start hurting the company. Not that I've gotten rid of all those at all, even today, but they've been corralled enough with the Lord's help and the Lord's surrender to allow me to function as a decent leader.
Wow. In the book, Sacred Pace, first of all, there's something in that title, Sacred Pace. and in the subtitle is 4 steps to hearing God and aligning yourself with his will. The things you recount in this book, were those formed during that season leading up to the founding of Texon, or how did that, was timetables?
Well, I didn't realize any of this, those 4 steps, until they started getting some context years and years later, actually. But the first time to really do it is when I agreed to 40 hours a week and no sales goals, those metric goals. That was the dying to self, so to speak. That was getting neutral, where I wanted his will more than my own, that I really wanted to honor him and glorify him and honor my family at the expense of me. So that was really the kickoff of me starting to learn the sacred pace.
Okay.
I just couldn't articulate it or know really what was going on at the time.
Well, I think you just expressed one of those steps, but can you walk through the 4 for us and tell us what the Lord taught you in the midst of those, and kind of.
Sure.
Yeah, thanks.
Sure. The first step is what I call consult your friend Jesus. And let me say, they're not in steps in sequence, meaning you never quit praying through this process, because the whole real critical thing is for you to get to where you want his will more than yours. So one of the steps is start praying. Consult your friend Jesus. He says in John 15:15, he wants to be your friend. So I say, well, I'm going to take him up on it. And so it's just process and prayer and seeking anything you can discern from him of doing whatever. The second step is gathering the facts, just like we do in business every day, that when we're trying to make decisions. I actually call this process my secret weapon in business, because most Christians don't actually go to this extent and length to trying to finally get to where you can discern his will. But in gathering the facts, that's obvious, just like a due diligence process. But it's also, I learned that I realized that so often I thought my opinion was a fact. And when you're praying for objectivity and praying to want to do his will, you start seeing where your opinions are facts, and you start having to die to those because that's just an opinion. And then another thing I tended to do is when I would get a fact that really elevated my or increased the odds of me wanting to get what I wanted, I would give it more credibility. I would elevate it. And likewise, when I'd get a fact that I didn't like, I would try to dismiss it or discount it. Well, when you're praying for objectivity, God doesn't let you do that. So this is a whole process of trying to surrender in a way and get neutral, as I call it, where you want his will. I also did motivational lists to try to figure out what I was motivated about, and the pluses and minuses list, pros and cons list, anything I could do to try to start seeing the truth, the real truth. Third step is watch for circumstances. And obviously everybody says, well, how do I know that? Well, my sense is if you're really trying to do God's will and you draw on Psalm 37:4, which says, delight in the Lord and he'll give you the desires of your heart. So here's the God of the universe in Psalm 37:4 saying, if you'll delight in me, I'm going to give you the desires of your heart. And so often we don't even know the desires of our heart. I don't. And so I believe he'll show you which circumstances matter, which one you need to hang on to and do something about. And the final step, which is the hardest step, is to get to where you're willing to jump off the cliff to do his will when he finally reveals it. Now, backing up just a minute, I had a preference in all those, and it sure wasn't to start at 40 hours a week, so to speak. But Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane had a preference that he didn't want to go to the cross for all humankind and carry the sins to the cross. But 3 different times he asked God, would you take this cup? But obviously 3 different times he said, but your will over mine, Lord. So even he had a preference, but he surrendered it. And so you end up having to kind of die to self, so to speak. And the issue with that is just really hard to die to self. But you have to decide, what is there worth dying to? And in the case of, so from a simplicity standpoint, you can't die to self if you're not willing to die to something or somebody. I say, well, God sees the future and I don't. God knows best and I just occasionally do and often think I do. And lastly, he's just unconditional love. The kind of love we'll never be able to really understand to the level that he loves me and everybody around me. So I'm going, wow, golly, why would I not surrender to that? Well, pride, greed, fear, lust, envy, whatever, anger, all those things. So you're surrendering all of that to when you're finally willing to say, okay, Lord, whatever you reveal, I'm going to jump off the cliff and do it. And at that point, he gives me peace in the gut. And the reason I wrote the book is because I wanted the average person in the pew that feels like they're not getting any big answers from the Lord on big decisions, that they can use this process and finally get to where they can hear God and know it and never look back, because they get that conviction in their gut. And much as I hated that 40-hour-a-week deal, I knew that's what I was supposed to do. And so that's the blessing I wanted to show. And the last thing I'll say about that is George Mueller in the 1800s has a great discernment process that you can refer and look up to. But he says, look, 90% of the issue is solved, 90%, when you finally get to where you want to do God's will over your own. And I call that getting neutral in my vernacular.
Yeah. I love that expression, getting to neutral. So you're saying, I'm not driving it forward and I'm not holding it back. Is that right? Right. If it goes path A or path B, as long as it's his, I'm fine with either one.
And eventually it's fine.
Yeah.
And then, I wanted to put another chapter in the book at the end saying you actually start get neutral and surrendering day by day and throughout the day. And before you go into a meeting and quit having an agenda, quit having a prejudice, you start training yourself on the smaller decisions. This 4-step thing is painful and it takes weeks. The bigger the decision, obviously, the harder it is to die to self. But to just try before you go into a meeting to say, okay, I'll try to be objective. No, that's not a big death. It is a recognition that you got to lay yourself down before you go into that. This interview, my big prayer is I would surrender to his, let it be whatever he wants, that I get out of the way best I can.
Yeah. Wow. I love it. So here's the way you list the 4 steps in the book, and which you've just told us. Consult your friend Jesus, gather the facts. Right. And even in there, you're saying, I'm trying to winnow out between the facts that seem to be my advantage that I'm going to exalt, and the ones that seem to be against my preference that I tend to ignore. So I got to sort through those. Consult friend Jesus, gather the facts, watch for circumstance, and get to neutral. And that's that place of surrender that you're describing.
And then once you get the courage and you see neutral and you see his will, don't delay jumping off the cliff. A friend of mine I've been mentoring, he got peace in his gut like 3 different times. And he said, but should I do it? I mean, I said, man, there's nothing good about delaying it. I mean, the devil and your mind can play all kind of games on. Don't start second guessing. And I'll tell you, once I've jumped off the cliff, I never second guessed myself because I had that conviction from the Lord.
So step 1, consult your friend Jesus. Okay, those 2 words together, friend Jesus, might sound kind of foreign to some people. Okay, did you always think like Jesus is my friend, and what do you mean by that? If it sounds kind of like unusual to somebody.
Well, truthfully, when I started that chapter, I started with calling it my best friend, but I took out the word best because I didn't want anybody to think I was his best friend. How arrogant on my part. But, when you think about a friend, it's a great listener. And I'm going, man, who can be a better listener? Who is a better listener? Jesus. Who cares more for me than Jesus versus a regular human friend? Who knows more? Who's more wise? You list what a great best friend is, and he's got it down. Other than he's often quieter than your best friend. So it's not easy. Now, the other thing I was blessed with is early on in my walk after accepting, being born again, he blessed me in San Diego in a hotel, just doing a little vacation, with being completely overwhelmed me with Jesus's love. And I cried like a baby. And that has blessed me for these decades. And I continue to go back to that feeling. And every time I can feel his love a little more or again, I am more lovable and more loving. And it's, for anybody listening that hadn't felt his love deep in his soul, it is so liberating and such a blessing. So it's not hard for me to call him my friend, though we are in a lot of ways very unequally yoked for obvious reasons. But on any one item, I'm trying to get equally yoked. Any one decision, I'm trying hard to get equally yoked with him to the level that he allows me.
Thank you. That's good. So, we got a lot going on in our world right now, a lot going on in people's businesses and careers and family stress, all kinds of stuff, time like this. So if there's a guy out there and he's like, he thinks he's burned out right now, or he's just at the end of his rope, what advice do you give that guy who's just like, I'm toast? What do I do now?
Pain is a great teacher. It can be a great friend. But I've had a few people ask me, say, I've got a friend about burnout. should I give him your book? I said, give it to him right after he burns out. He'll finally have enough pain to want to, like me, he's ready to make changes. You know, one of the things is not to blame the circumstances. You got to start taking ownership of burning out. Yeah, the circumstances are terrible going on around, but you got to start taking some ownership and looking into your sin as to why you're so burned out. But mechanically, I've got several suggestions in the book, but yeah, take walks. You might need some vitamin B12. You probably need to do a little meditation of just turning your brain off for 20 minutes a day, doing something physical, exercise, things like that. You know, one of the real boundaries that I think is one of the best in the book is when somebody asks you to do something, tell them I'll give you an answer tomorrow. Now, it's not necessarily your boss or whatever, but when somebody asks you to go play golf or teach Sunday school or do an interview or whatever, tell them I'll give you an answer tomorrow. Because if I answer right now, my people pleasing will either creep in, or my desire to be noticed, or my pride will creep in, and usually I say yes. The next day, I've got the same amount of sin, but it's not rearing its head to where I can objectively either talk to Doris, pray about it, or stay objective and realize, no, that doesn't fit what I should be doing, or I for sure don't have time to do that, or do it at that juncture when they've asked. So that's a little bit of what I'd suggest. And therapy, obviously, if it's becoming a major obstacle, whatever's in your life that's really preventing you from having a reasonably normal life, whatever that looks like, don't discount therapy with a great therapist, and not just an average one.
That is fantastic. Yeah. You know, one of the things you said in your book is, I think it was just a line in there, but it stuck with me so much, that you had to work hard to be unimpressive, not because the inclination is so strong in that way. And I love that delay, sort of like a delay on a live broadcast. I'm going to delay till tomorrow, so I don't get the impulse,
Well, one of the things I do is also, I have a new idea. If it's material and it's going to either cost money or people's time, I'll delay the decision for 1 week and actually just park it. I don't even pray about it. And 80% of the time, minimum, a week later, it's a bad idea. And I have, a lot of ideas going on a lot of times. So I mean, I have to surrender those, delay them. And it's amazing how high the percentage is. So I've saved everybody from going left now, and then again another one says, well, no, go right. That's no longer, I don't need that. Yeah, that wasn't a good idea. I mean, just that alone has helped my burnout of delaying decisions. God's slow as molasses. So delaying it a week is still way fast enough for him to still show you whether that's his will or not, something you should be doing.
That is great. Well, Terry, I really appreciate you being with us today and sharing your heart. I do have a couple questions to come in, and so before we cut off, I'd love to at least let a couple of these come in. One says, in your book, you write about decisions you made beginning in 2008 associated with your company's natural gas division. And can you discuss what the Lord taught you during that chapter of your life and how you apply those learnings today?
Well, I say in general, when I make a bad decision, I have a philosophy. I'm going to make it up multiple fold by learning my lesson in the future. So if I have something that costs me, whatever, $100,000 or $1 million or whatever it costs, or pain with people, I just make it a philosophy. I am going to learn my lesson well enough to be able to leverage that into multiple times in the future to multiple times more than offset my mistake. So that's a general philosophy for me. So in the natural gas, I mean, entrepreneurs know and learned that they hate to give up. And I just wouldn't give up. I wouldn't give up. And my management team was telling me I needed to give up, and I just wouldn't do it. And so I understand that, and yet I wouldn't give up. And finally, the pain got great enough. It's affecting the morale and the culture of our company. I finally had to sell it. And so the lesson I learned out of that is, for sure, it can, those delaying your decisions that sure, I mean, your ego, failure, you know, whatever reasons I was delaying, I've learned to hold those businesses lighter. I've sold several businesses over the years. I've just always sold them as a success, and that one was sold as a failure.
Well, one more, and then we know we have to cut off. But someone
Sure.
says were you pretty open about your struggles while you were walking through them, or was it only later where you were able to be comfortable sharing your testimony and what God was up to in your life with others?
I've learned that everybody's different about transparency and vulnerability. I'm not the greatest speaker in the world and never will be, but one of my real strengths has always been vulnerability and transparency. And so I have to be real careful, because some of my employees or whatever, or friends or family, aren't that away. So when I share something about them, they may very well think that was very inappropriate. When I'm thinking, oh, no big deal, I tell that about me all the time. So I've had to discern the difference in my personality. I'm not saying I'm better, I'm just different. My wife doesn't like to share near as much as I do in groups or people, or even one-on-one. And I've always been kind of an open book. And I think for these interviews and this book, it is, rather than giving off on theological things, because I'm not very theologically sound, I go with my strengths and where God's called me. And so that's kind of who I am and how I operate.
Yeah, that's really good. Well, Terry, thanks again. Just so everybody knows, the book again is called Sacred Pace. And this is not an advertisement to go buy the book. There's a book out there that will really provide some shoe leather right where you live help, and it plumbs down into the things we've talked about here today in a really beneficial way. In fact, we had one other comment from someone who wrote in the midst of our time, who said, excellent book, I could not put it down, I highly recommend it. And that comes from another real
I couldn't
leader.
put it down either. It only took me 5 years though to write the dumb thing.
Well, we appreciate your sweat, man. Yeah, we're living off your effort. So thank you for that. That is really great. So Terry, thanks again for being with us today. And we'll look forward to having you back another time, because I know that there's a lot more in the well of experience there that we could all draw from, brother.
Unfortunately. Okay, bye.
Thanks a ton. We'll see you.